The lonely cowboy helped an Apache girl on the road. Unaware of the deadly danger ahead, the sun was high, hanging in the sky like a fiery ball, casting a bright light over the wide, empty plains. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and dust, and the only sound for miles was the rhythmic thud of horse hooves hitting the ground. Cade, a cowboy through and through, had been riding for hours, his leather coat flapping gently in the breeze. His horse, a sturdy chestnut named Dusty, carried him along the familiar road, a lonely trail that stretched endlessly ahead. Cade was used to being alone. His ranch was miles from the nearest town, and he didn't mind the solitude. There was peace in it. The quiet was comforting after long days spent working cattle or fixing fences. There was no one to talk to, no need for conversation. The land itself spoke to him, the open skies and wide fields filling him with a sense of purpose. But even the most solitary of men could feel the sting of loneliness now and then, especially on days like this, when the horizon seemed to stretch on forever, and there was nothing but the dull hum of the wind. As Cade rode, his mind wandered. He thought about the long days of work ahead and the solitude he would return to when this ride was over. But then, as if the land itself had something to say, something broke the silence ahead. A figure, small and far off in the distance, caught his eye. At first, Cade thought it was just another trick of the heat waves rising from the earth, but as he got closer, he realized it was a person. He slowed Dusty to a walk and squinted his eyes, trying to make out the figure more clearly. A woman. No, a girl, really. She was young, probably not more than 15 or 16, with long black hair tangled by the wind. She was standing at the side of the road, her clothes dirty and torn, as though she had been walking for a long time. Her face was grim, her eyes downcast, and she didn't seem to notice Cade's approach. Her posture was tense, like she was waiting for something or someone. For a moment, Cade considered riding on. People in these parts were often wary of outsiders, and he wasn't exactly in the mood for company. But there was something about the girl's stillness that caught his attention. She looked out of place, and Cade wasn't the kind to ignore someone in need, no matter their background. "Need a ride?" Cade called out, his voice rough from the dry air. The girl looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time. Cade saw the flash of fear in her gaze before it quickly turned into something else. Wariness, maybe even distrust. He knew that look. It was the kind of look you gave to a stranger who might not have the best intentions. But her fear wasn't entirely about him. There was something else, something deeper in her eyes, as though she was running from something far worse than a cowboy on a horse. She hesitated, glancing at him from head to toe, as if measuring the risk. Cade didn't push. He just kept his eyes on her, his hand resting loosely on the reins. After a long pause, the girl took a step forward, her feet dragging in the dirt as if the weight of the world was on her shoulders. She didn't say anything at first, but then, in a soft voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Where are you headed?" she asked, her accent faint but clear. "Just riding through," Cade replied, his voice steady. "Where are you headed?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, her gaze flickered around, as though looking for something, or someone. Then, after what felt like an eternity of silence, she finally spoke, her voice quieter now. "Anywhere. Just anywhere," she said, her words trailing off, filled with uncertainty. Cade felt a knot tighten in his chest. There was a story behind her words, a story that didn't want to be told, but was begging to be heard. He could see it in her eyes, the kind of eyes that carried pain. "Look, I can give you a ride. It's a long way to town from here," Cade offered gently, his tone softer than before. "You'll be safe with me, miss. I'm just a cowboy trying to make my way." The girl looked at him again, as if deciding whether she could trust him. Cade didn't press. He simply waited. After a long silence, she took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging slightly as if some invisible weight had been lifted. "All right," she said finally, "I'll come with you." Without another word, she climbed onto the back of Cade's horse, sitting gingerly behind him, her small frame barely making a dent in the seat. Cade nudged Dusty forward, and they began to move again, the sounds of the hooves and the wind filling the air. For the next few hours, they rode in silence. Cade didn't push for conversation, and the girl didn't speak unless spoken to. He offered her some water from his canteen, and she took it gratefully, but she didn't say much. It was clear that she was exhausted physically and emotionally. She had the look of someone who had been through too much for too long. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of orange and red, Cade could see the exhaustion etched in her face. He wanted to ask her what had happened, why she was out here alone in the middle of nowhere. But he knew better than to pry. People had their reasons, and sometimes it was best to let them share when they were ready. "Where you from?" Cade asked, breaking the silence, trying to make the journey a little less awkward. The girl's eyes flickered at the question, and for a moment Cade wondered if she would answer at all. But then she spoke, her voice quiet and distant. "I'm from the Apache reservation near the river." Cade nodded, trying to place the name. He wasn't familiar with all the reservations, but he knew the Apache were known for their fierce spirit, their deep connection to the land. "Must have been a long ride," Cade said softly, his eyes scanning the horizon. The girl didn't answer right away, and Cade knew that the weight of whatever she was running from was heavy, but he didn't press. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, keeping the pace steady, knowing that sometimes silence was the most respectful thing you could offer someone. As they rode into the evening, the last light of day disappearing behind the hills, Cade couldn't help but feel the weight of the journey they were both on. He was just a cowboy helping a girl out of the kindness of his heart. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this simple act of kindness was leading them both into something much bigger than either of them could have imagined. As the days passed, the road stretched on before them, the landscape slowly shifting with each mile. Cade and Tala rode together, side by side, a small, unexpected team in the wide, lonely world. They didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that came with two people who didn't need words to understand each other. Every morning, Cade would wake before the sun, tending to his horse and making sure they had enough provisions. Tala would quietly watch him, her gaze calm, though there was something in her eyes that suggested she was thinking deeply. At first, Cade didn't push her to talk. He could sense that there was something heavy on her mind, something she wasn't ready to share, and he respected that. She wasn't just a girl traveling the road. There was more to her story, and Cade knew better than to pry into it. They took turns riding point, keeping a sharp lookout for anything that might seem out of place. The land around them was open and wild, a sea of grass and dirt with only the occasional cactus or rock outcrop to break the monotony. It was beautiful in its own way, but Cade knew better than to let his guard down. This was a land that could be as deadly as it was beautiful, and a man had to be careful, especially when traveling with someone he didn't fully understand. Over time, Tala began to open up, though it was in small, measured pieces. One evening, as they sat by the campfire, the crackling of the flames the only sound between them, Tala finally spoke. "I never wanted to leave," she said softly, her eyes watching the fire dance in the dark. But there wasn't a choice. Cade stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue. He didn't want to interrupt, to make her feel like she needed to explain anything she wasn't ready to. But after a few moments, Tala spoke again. "The reservation. It wasn't home anymore," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not after the last raid. They took everything. My family, my people. There was nothing left for me there." Cade could hear the pain in her voice, a pain that ran deep. He could see the way her hands clenched in her lap, her knuckles white from the tension. It wasn't just the loss of her family, though. Cade could sense that there was more to it, but he didn't ask. He knew this wasn't something that could be fixed by a simple question. "Where did you go after that?" Cade asked, keeping his voice gentle. Tala looked up at the stars above them, her expression distant, as if she was searching for something out there in the vast sky. "I had nowhere to go," she answered quietly. "I just started walking. I thought I could find peace somewhere. But I haven't." Cade nodded, understanding more than he let on. He didn't have the same kind of loss in his life, but he knew what it was like to feel like you didn't belong, to feel like you were out of place in the world. He had spent years working alone on his ranch, keeping to himself, finding peace in solitude, but he had also wondered more than once if there was more to life than just working the land. The next few days passed with more of the same, quiet, steady riding with the occasional conversation. Tala would sometimes share small memories of her life back on the reservation, and Cade would listen. He didn't judge. He just listened, offering comfort when he could, and giving space when she needed it. One afternoon they stopped at a small stream to rest. The cool water bubbled over rocks, providing a refreshing break from the heat of the day. Cade tied Dusty to a nearby tree and unpacked their gear, while Tala knelt by the water to wash her face. Cade sat down on a nearby rock, watching her as she cleaned herself. There was something calming about the way she moved, her grace evident even in such a simple task. He didn't know why, but it made him think of the way things used to be, before the hardships, before the loneliness. Tala caught his gaze for a moment, and there was a flicker of something, an unspoken understanding maybe, before she quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing slightly. Cade smiled to himself, but said nothing. It wasn't the time for awkwardness. Not yet. After their break, they continued on their journey. As the days turned into a week, Cade began to notice subtle changes in Tala. The fear that had once held her tight seemed to be loosening. She no longer jumped at every unfamiliar sound, no longer looked over her shoulder at every passing rider. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, she was starting to trust again. Cade couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in that, even though he knew it wasn't really him she was trusting. It was the journey, the road they were on together. One evening, as they set up camp, Cade glanced over at Tala, who was tending to the fire. The glow from the flames lit her face in a way that made her look older, wiser, as if the weight of her past was slowly being replaced by something stronger. Cade realized then that she wasn't just a lost girl on the road anymore. She was becoming something more, someone who had found strength in the very survival that had once seemed impossible. "I'm glad I met you, Cade," Tala said suddenly, breaking the silence. Cade turned his head toward her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. He wasn't used to hearing people say things like that, but there it was, plain as day. "Glad I met you too," Cade replied, his voice steady. For a moment the fire crackled between them, the warmth of the flames mixing with the quiet understanding they had found in each other. Cade had never expected this. A connection, a bond built on nothing more than shared time on the road. And yet it was there, strong and unspoken. He didn't know where the road ahead would lead, but for the first time in a long time he felt that maybe it didn't matter. Whatever came next, he wasn't going to face it alone. As the stars began to twinkle above, Cade sat back and relaxed for the first time in days. The journey had been long, and there was still a long way to go. But he had the sense that things were changing. And for once, the road ahead didn't seem quite so lonely. The days had been long and the sun unforgiving, but there was a certain peace that Cade found in the steady rhythm of the ride. He had grown used to the silence between him and Tala, and although they rarely spoke, he couldn't deny that their presence together made the journey feel less lonely. But as the days passed, Cade began to notice something in Tala that he hadn't before, a sense of restlessness, an unease that seemed to grow stronger with every mile. Tala had always been quiet, but lately she had begun to look over her shoulder more often. Her eyes would dart from side to side as if she were expecting something, or someone, to appear out of the dust and wind. Cade wasn't sure if he should ask her about it. He knew there was something on her mind, something she wasn't ready to share, and he wasn't the type to force her to talk. But the feeling that something was wrong lingered in the air, thick and heavy. It was on the third morning of the fourth week of their journey that the tension finally broke. They had camped near a small creek the night before, and Cade had just finished packing up the camp when he noticed Tala's demeanor had changed. She was standing by her horse, her hand gripping the reins tightly, her eyes scanning the horizon with a nervous intensity. Cade didn't need to ask. He had seen that look before, the look of someone who could feel danger long before it arrived. "Tala?" he called out, walking toward her. She didn't respond at first, but her eyes shifted to meet his. There was a flicker of something in them, a warning, perhaps. "We need to move," she said quickly, her voice sharp. "Now." Cade felt a chill run down his spine. There was urgency in her voice, and it wasn't the kind of urgency that came from fear of the unknown. No, this was something different, something she had seen before, something she knew all too well.
"What is it? What's wrong?" Cade asked, trying to keep his voice steady.
"Riders," she said, her voice low and urgent. "They're coming for me." Cade's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to ask who they were. He had seen the way Tala's eyes had darkened whenever she mentioned the past, the way she avoided talking about her life before the road. It was clear that whoever was after her wasn't just some passing traveler. These were people she feared, and that fear, Cade realized, had been growing for days. "Are they far?" Cade asked, already reaching for his rifle, his mind racing. Tala nodded, her face pale. "Not far. They've been following us for a while. I didn't think they'd catch up so soon." Without another word, Cade swung into the saddle, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea who these riders were, but one thing was certain. He wasn't about to let anything happen to Tala. He glanced over at her, seeing the same determination in her eyes that he had seen when they first met. She wasn't just running from something. She was ready to fight for her survival, and that was something Cade respected. "We need to move," he said, his voice firm. "We'll make it to the hills. We can lose them there." Tala didn't hesitate. She mounted her horse swiftly, and the two of them rode off, the sound of hooves echoing in the empty desert air. The wind whipped around them, the heat of the day pressing down on their backs as they raced toward the hills in the distance. Cade's mind raced as fast as the horses beneath them. He had been in a lot of tight situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was something more personal. Whoever was chasing Tala wasn't going to stop until they had her, and Cade wasn't sure how far he was willing to go to protect her. As they neared the hills, Cade's instincts kicked in. He knew the terrain well, and he led the way, weaving through the rocks and ridges, hoping to lose their pursuers. But as the hours passed, his anxiety only grew. There was no sign of their pursuers, but he could feel their presence like a shadow just behind them, waiting for the right moment to strike. They stopped at a narrow pass between two large rock formations, a place where they could hide for a while. The horses were breathing heavily, their bodies covered in sweat from the long ride. Cade dismounted and tied them both to a nearby tree, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. Tala followed him, but she didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. They both knew what was coming. "I think we've lost them for now," Cade said quietly, his voice low. "But they'll be back." Tala nodded, but her face was pale, her eyes distant. It was clear she was thinking of something else, something far more dangerous than the riders chasing them. Cade didn't need to ask her to know that she had been running from these people for a long time. Whoever they weren't going to stop, and neither would she. "We need to keep moving," Tala said finally, breaking the silence. "We can't stay here for long." Cade looked at her, his mind spinning with questions. Who are they? Why are they after you? But Tala only shook her head. "I can't say. Not yet." The words were heavy in the air, and Cade knew she was telling the truth. Whatever her reasons for keeping quiet, he could tell they weren't just about fear. There was something more. A history between her and these riders, a story she wasn't ready to share. "We'll keep moving," Cade said, his voice steady. "But we'll need to be careful."
"If they catch up to us, we need to be ready." Tala didn't argue.
She knew as well as he did that the road ahead was going to be dangerous. There was no turning back now. They had crossed a point of no return, and whatever came next, they would face it together. As the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the desert with streaks of orange and red, Cade felt a sense of finality settle over him. They weren't just running anymore. They were running toward something, toward a danger they couldn't outrun. But in that moment, Cade didn't care. He would stand by Tala no matter what. The wind had shifted, bringing with it a fresh scent of dust and the unmistakable sound of hooves in the distance. Cade felt it before he heard it, a gut feeling that told him the riders were closing in. His pulse quickened, and for the first time since they had begun this journey, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just a chase. It was a fight. A fight for something much more precious than either of them had realized. Tala had been right. The riders weren't just following them. They were hunting them. And Cade, for all his years of handling cattle and building fences, was about to face an enemy unlike anything he'd ever known. He had been a cowboy his entire life, but this was something else. They had found a temporary refuge in the hills, a narrow pass between towering rock formations. It was a place that Cade knew well, a place he had once used to escape the world for a while. But now it felt more like a trap, a place to make a stand. The sound of hooves grew louder, and Cade's grip tightened on the rifle slung over his shoulder. He turned to Tala, who was already readying herself. She had her knife out, her hands steady, though her face was tense, betraying the fear she had been holding inside for days. Cade could see that she was ready. This was not the frightened girl he had met on the road. This was someone else, someone who had been hardened by the cruelty of the world and the dangers she had faced. "Stay close," Cade said quietly, his voice calm despite the adrenaline rushing through him. "We'll fight them off, but we need to be smart." Tala nodded, her eyes never leaving the path that led into the pass. She was poised, ready for whatever came next, but there was a heaviness in her eyes, a recognition that the fight ahead might be more than either of them could handle. They didn't have much time. Cade could see the dust rising in the distance, the riders coming closer, their shapes becoming clearer against the setting sun. There were 5 of them, each riding fast, their horses kicking up the dirt as they rode with purpose. Cade couldn't make out their faces, but the way they rode told him everything he needed to know. These men were experienced. They had been tracking them for days, and now they were closing in. "Get ready," Cade said, his voice barely a whisper. Tala took a deep breath, her hand tightening around the hilt of her knife. "I've been ready for this," she said, her voice steady, though Cade could see the flash of something. Anger? Determination? Perhaps both. She was no stranger to danger. As the riders drew nearer, Cade could feel the tension in the air. The wind had died down, leaving behind an eerie stillness. He could almost hear the thrum of his own heartbeat in the silence, the weight of the moment settling in his chest. This wasn't just about protecting Tala anymore. This was about standing up to whatever threat they posed and refusing to back down. The riders reached the entrance to the pass, and for a moment there was no movement, only the distant sound of horses shifting and the faint creak of leather saddles. Cade could feel his muscles tightening, every instinct telling him to be ready. He had been in enough fights to know that the first move was always the most important. Then, without warning, one of the riders spurred his horse forward, his voice carrying across the narrow space. "The girl! She's coming with us!" Cade's hand went to his rifle, but he didn't draw it yet. He knew better than to make the first move unless it was absolutely necessary. He needed to stay calm. He needed to wait. He glanced at Tala, who stood beside him, her face hardening. She wasn't afraid anymore. If anything, the anger was beginning to take over, and Cade could see it in the way she held her knife, the way she stood tall, not backing down.
"She's not going anywhere," Cade said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had made up his mind.
"You're not taking her. Anyway."
The rider on the lead horse sneered, his lips curling into a grin. "You think you can stop us? You're outnumbered, cowboy." Cade didn't flinch. "I'll do what I have to." There was a moment of silence, and then, as if on cue, the riders began to move. Cade's heart was pounding in his chest as he raised his rifle, aiming it steady, but not yet firing. He could see the tension in the other riders' bodies. They were preparing for a fight. But they hadn't expected this. Tala took a step forward, her eyes locked on the rider who had spoken. "I'm not your prize," she said coldly, her voice carrying the weight of her defiance. "And I'm not going anywhere." The lead rider's grin faltered, but he quickly recovered, drawing his own weapon. Cade's finger hovered over the trigger of his rifle, but before he could make his move, one of the other riders lunged forward, his horse galloping straight at them. Without hesitation, Cade fired. The sound of the shot echoed through the pass, and the rider fell from his horse, rolling into the dirt. The others paused, but only for a moment, before they spurred their horses forward, charging toward Cade and Tala. Tala was already moving, her knife flashing in the fading light. She was fast, her movement sharp and controlled, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. Cade's rifle barked again, taking down another rider, but there were still 3 left, and they were closing in fast. Cade's eyes never left the remaining riders. He could see the way they circled, their horses kicking up dust, trying to surround them. He knew they were experienced, but so was he, and with Tala by his side, they had a fighting chance. The battle was brutal, fast, and chaotic. Cade kept his distance, using his rifle to pick off riders one by one, while Tala moved like a shadow, swift and silent, taking down anyone who got too close. She was a force to be reckoned with, her small frame belying the strength and skill she had honed over years of survival. As the last rider fell, the pass fell silent. Cade lowered his rifle, his body shaking with the adrenaline of the fight. The dust hung heavy in the air, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of their breath breath and the distant rumble of thunder in the sky. "We're not out of the woods yet," Cade said, his voice low and strained. "But we've bought ourselves some time." Tala nodded, wiping the sweat from her brow. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, but there was something in her eyes, a recognition that she owed him more than just gratitude.
"You don't have to thank me," Cade replied, his voice steady but tired. "I promised I'd protect you."
"And that's what I'm going to do." They stood together in the quiet aftermath, the weight of the battle settling in, but the promise of survival stronger than ever. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The day was coming to an end, and the once bright sky was now a soft shade of purple, with the first stars beginning to twinkle faintly in the distance. The battle had left its mark on both Cade and Tala. They were both exhausted, physically and mentally. But the reality of their situation was setting in. Despite their victory, the riders they had fought were only a small part of the danger they faced. The true threat was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before it came for them again. Cade took a deep breath, wiping the sweat from his brow as he surveyed the narrow pass they had used as their battleground. The sounds of the fight had faded, and now there was only silence, broken occasionally by the soft rustle of the wind. The horses were grazing nearby, tired but unharmed, as the two of them stood in the stillness of the moment. It was hard to believe that just hours ago they had been surrounded by enemies, fighting for their lives. "Are you okay?" Cade asked, glancing at Tala, his voice low and concerned. Tala stood a few steps away from him, her posture tense, though her eyes seemed far away. She had been quiet since the fight ended, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. For a moment she didn't answer, as if lost in her own world. Then she turned to Cade, her face hardening. "I'll be fine," she said quietly. Her voice held the weight of someone who had faced more than one fight in their life. "But we can't stay here. They'll come back." Cade nodded. He knew she was right. Their victory had been hard won, but it was only temporary. The riders they had faced weren't the only ones who wanted Tala. There were more out there, and Cade had no doubt that they would stop at nothing to track her down. "Let's keep moving," Cade said, his voice steady. He had no intention of letting anything happen to her, not after everything they had been through. "We'll head for the hills, find shelter, and regroup." Tala didn't argue. She didn't speak much after that, but Cade could tell she was already thinking ahead, planning their next move. She had grown more confident in the time they had spent together, and Cade admired her for it. She was a survivor, no doubt about it. They mounted their horses, the familiar rhythm of the ride settling back in as they set off toward the hills in the distance. Cade led the way, his eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of danger, but he knew they had to keep moving. Every second counted. The night crept in slowly, the shadows of the hills stretching long behind them as they rode on. Cade kept his focus sharp, his mind constantly turning over their situation. He knew they couldn't outrun the danger forever. They needed a plan. They needed to find a way to stop the riders from following them, to keep Tala safe. But the thought of where they could go, what they could do, felt overwhelming. Tala, sensing Cade's thoughts, spoke up, her voice cutting through the silence of the night. "There's a cabin not far from here. It's secluded, hidden. We can rest there for a while, but we'll need to be careful." Cade turned to look at her, surprised by the sudden information. He hadn't expected her to know of such a place, but he should have known better. Tala was resourceful, and her knowledge of the land was just as strong as his own. "How far?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. "Not far," she said, glancing over her shoulder toward the darkening landscape. "We'll have to cross through a narrow trail to get there, but it's the safest place I know." Cade nodded. It sounded like their best option, at least for now. He trusted her judgment, and if Tala thought the cabin was a safe place to rest, then it was as good a choice as any. They pushed forward, riding through the quiet night, the only sounds being the soft clop of the horses' hooves and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As they neared the cabin, Cade could see the faint outline of the structure ahead. It was small, tucked away between the trees, nearly hidden from view, the kind of place where someone could disappear if they wanted to, the kind of place where they could rest, catch their breath, and regroup. Cade's heart slowed a little as they approached, the tension in his body easing just slightly. But even as they drew closer, he knew they couldn't let their guard down. Not yet. They dismounted and led the horses to a small corral at the back of the cabin, hidden from view. Cade checked the area, making sure there was no sign of recent activity, no indication that anyone had been there recently. The cabin seemed undisturbed, though he knew better than to assume it was completely safe. Tala was already inside, checking the rooms for any signs of danger, her movements quick and purposeful. "I think we're safe for now," she said, her voice low as she returned to the door. "But we need to keep watch. They'll be looking for us." Cade nodded, pushing open the door to the small cabin. The inside was sparse but functional. A fireplace on one side of the room, a couple of worn chairs, and a table in the center. It wasn't much, but it would do for a short stay. Cade took a deep breath, letting the silence of the cabin fill the air. "We'll rest here for a while," Cade said, his voice steady. "Get some sleep. But in the morning, we need to move again." Tala nodded, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything, but Cade could tell she was already thinking about the next steps. She had been on the run for so long, it was second nature to her now. But Cade wasn't going to let her face it alone. He couldn't. They both sat down, each lost in their thoughts as the night stretched on. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. But the peace felt fleeting, as though the danger was still out there, waiting. Cade's mind raced with thoughts of what came next. They couldn't stay in the cabin forever. They couldn't keep running from whatever threat was following them. But for the first time since they'd met, he felt a flicker of hope. They had made it this far. They had fought back, survived the worst of the danger, and now they were here, in the quiet of the cabin, with a chance to rest. As the night wore on, Cade finally allowed himself to relax, if only a little. Tomorrow would come with its own set of challenges, but for now, they were safe. They had made it through the worst of it, and that was something. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. And Cade, for the first time in a long while, wasn't alone.